Bonjour à tous. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our day 3 of the cybersecurity workshop. Before we get started, there are a couple of questions that we'd like to answer. Some of them were not answered on day 2. So we'd like just to take a moment to go through the material. So one question that we've received was regarding SSH keys and what's the relationship between the SSH tunnel and the keys that you've generated to authenticate to teach. So just to go back here to this slide, the first 3 steps you see here, step 1, 2, 3, they are really used to establish the SSH tunnel, so to establish this secure channel. And from there, step 4, this is really the steps where you would authenticate through the SSH server. So remember, the first time we did the exercise was authentication via a password. And then the second time we did the authentication via SSH keys. So the SSH keys that you've created is completely different use of the one that are here located on the SSH server. So step 1, 2, 3, they are using asymmetric encryption as well as symmetric encryption. So asymmetric encryption with the use of the public key and private key from the SSH server is used actually to transmit a private key that is used as part of the symmetric encryption that will be used to create that channel on step 3. So there is a mix of both asymmetric and symmetric encryption. But again, this concept on step 4 is very different. That's the authentication layer, so it has nothing to do with the establishment of the SSH tunnel. So once you're authenticated, you can move data from the server to the client back and forth. It's going through the channel. But again, it has nothing to do with the keys that you've created. So as part of the question we've received, we had Christopher who asked, do we still get any of the security benefits of SSH keys if the server we are authenticating to continues to accept password authentication as an option? So if on the SSH server we have both passwords and SSH keys, is it worth using keys? And the answer is not really. So the reason for that is because you'll still be vulnerable to password attacks that we've described on day 2. So if both passwords and SSH keys are allowed on the SSH server, there is no really, very huge benefit in using SSH keys. So you may wonder, why is that? At Niagara, we have both password and SSH keys. So this is something that we are currently exploring. We'd like to actually restrict the authentication to SSH keys only, so that we can take the most of the benefits of having SSH keys. So we are really encouraging the users in using SSH keys and creating them, because eventually we would like to restrict the authentication through keys. Another question we got was, can we trust browser AD block plugins such as uBlock Origin? So this was from Jay. For that one, uBlock Origin, yes, as long as you download it from a trusted source. If that's for Google Chrome, just go to Chrome website. And I see one question in the chat. Okay, sounds good.
I think, Rafael, I saw a hand raised, but I can't see it anymore. So if someone has a question, just feel free to put in the chat.
Yes, feel free. This concept here, even security, IT professional, even IT professional are sometimes confused with SSH because you have SSH keys on server and client, and you have SSH keys that you create for the authentication portion. So it can be very, very confusing. Attendance test 3 code. Marcello, is that, I can't remember the code for today. Okay, here we go.
It's number 2, just pasted on the chat.
Okay, so I'm just here. So assignment 2, are there any questions, any findings? Do you need any help? Were you able to create your keys? We can take a few minutes if you have anything you'd like to ask. Okay, so you can still go to the forum if there is anything, in the next couple of days. If you have some question that pop up in your mind, and just feel free to go to the forum and ask question, and we'll be there to answer any question you may have. Okay, Garrett. So after getting the key onto the Teach cluster, I was having trouble logging in with the key instead of a username or passwords. Okay, so Garrett, is that issue solved when you're saying you are having trouble, or were you still not able to authenticate? Not yet. Okay, so we can surely investigate after this call to check, the logs to see what is going on. So we can troubleshoot that further.
Okay, thank you.
And Mikhail, if we set up SSH keys to log into Niagara, would we not need to enter a password when logging in each time? So do you need, you mean we need to enter a password? You mean the passphrase on your private keys? I guess, I'm not too sure. If you have, so if you upload your public key to Niagara, then if you try to authenticate, that should be via the key, not the password. It will automatically detect your private key. Yeah, the passphrase for a key is different. Yes, absolutely. So that's the passphrase, and you can actually set up your SSH agent so that it recognizes it knows the passphrase. If you don't want to type every time the passphrase. Okay, Amit saying, checked his email address, gave me 2 data breaches, what should I do? Well, it depends, Amit, you just need to go into the details of when the data breaches happen, which sites were affected, which information was there, because sometimes it's just data breaches that would take your name and your password, in which case there is not much you can do. Sorry, your name and your email address. But if it says, your password was compromised on a specific website, then go there and change your password. And if you realize that you are using that password on different online resources, then that's a good idea to change it as well on the other resources where you were using the same password. So the answer is really case by case. You just need to go into the details of the data breaches. And yeah, and sometimes there is not much you can do, just being aware of it. Once the information is away and in the hands of other people, there's not much you can do. But yeah, if that's password compromise, you can change it, for example. Just going up, I think we've addressed all the questions. Okay, so now we'll get started. Today we have Rachel Zand. We have the pleasure to have Rachel Zand, Director of Human Research Ethics, who is there to talk about human research data and research ethic boards. And we're really, really excited to hear from Rachel. So, Rachel, this is all yours, and you probably want to zoom on the biggest slide. We see the comments.
Okay, let me figure out where I'm trying to go here. Let's see. If I want to do screen 1. Let's try that. Is that better?
You're showing us your notes.
You're seeing the notes. Okay, so let me figure out what I'm doing here. Obviously, I'm not the data person.
Or not a Zoom presenter, maybe.
I'm not a Zoom person. Let's see if I can share the screen. Okay, I think that's it. Is that good?
Yes,
Yes.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to start off by thanking Raphael and her team for inviting me today to discuss security considerations for sensitive human data. I'm hoping this will be an interactive session, so please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat as we go through. I'll see if I can actually see the chat as I'm going through. If not, I'll ask Raphael to help out with that. And if there are any questions, put your hand up. I'm willing to answer them as we go along. So human research data are valuable to both the researcher and to participants from whom they have been collected. However, they may also be valuable to third parties who may have malicious intent. Research ethics boards, or REBs, work with researchers to utilize a variety of measures to protect human research data and limit the potential for misuse. For today's presentation, I'm going to provide an overview that will include a brief description of human research, the breadth and depth of human research data, look at some ethical policies and standards for the review of human research, look at the human research data that are collected, discuss how research ethics boards evaluate the sensitivity of data collected in the context of overall risk, look at common privacy and security recommendations and requirements that REBs make, and this is within various aspects of the research data lifecycle. Acknowledge that there are areas of vulnerability or gaps in terms of REB knowledge as well as technology. I'm going to intersperse with some cautionary real-life tales, and after some question and answer, we can dive into 3 case studies. So let's start. So human research data collected involves many different research methods. Some of them you're probably well aware of. So the standard, thought of what human research looks like: intervention, so clinical trials, and other kinds of interventional, say nutritional trials, those kinds of things. Interactions where there's focus groups or interviews. Observational research, which may include ethnography or just participant observations, whether within settings or in the field. Surveys and questionnaires. Face-to-face research, which we haven't been doing so much of over the course of the pandemic, and people pivoting to virtual, remote, or online research. There's research using smartphones or wearables, so they collect everything from location data to the various use on apps or various sensors on the body. Research may occur on campus, so in an institution or in a traditional lab setting or a traditional clinical setting, but also in the field. This may be in neighborhoods within Toronto or in Ontario or Canada or even internationally. And I would say that we probably have at the University of Toronto researchers all over the world. We probably have on all continents, maybe even Antarctica, but probably the research data collected there is, if it's not on the environment, it's on each other, which is a whole other ethical debate. Participatory action research, where researchers are acting as activists as well and participating within a set, either community or a collective or a non-government organization. Critical inquiry research, where, and I'll talk a bit about this in a cautionary tale later on, where we have researchers that are looking at, for example, civil disobedience in authoritarian countries, and there's ethical issues around data security that come up from that. Research with indigenous communities, and there's the need for additional precautions and additional processes for those. And then there's analysis of databases or data sets, and that may be individual analyses or the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence. And then the data that's collected through these methods include personal health information, personally identifiable information, biospecimens that could have genomic information, also confidential information. So if people are going into say, doing critical inquiry research into companies and their practices, there may be confidential information that needs to be protected. Similarly, we have agreements with various industries where they want to test specific types of, say, engineering products, and there's confidential information that needs to be protected. Third-party information where an individual will be conducting, say, part of a survey or part of a questionnaire, and they will name another person or discuss the situation from another person. And so we need to worry about protecting the identity and the data about that third party because they haven't provided consent. Some of the research, primarily survey research, can be done anonymously. Others, identifiers are collected and data are de-identified at some point in time. We have research involving recordings, either video or audio, which has become commonplace now that everyone has phones with that capability. Photos, and there's a methodology called photo voice, whereby usually participants are given cameras or are told to use their phones to take pictures that represent how they feel about a certain situation or are evidence of their circumstances. Geographical data, such as GPS data, direct quotes or qualitative data, which can be linked to other aspects of data collection. People use direct quotes in their publications, and so we have to be concerned about the identifiability of those. And finally, the use of large data sets or databases, which may be research-based or may have started as either administrative data or clinical data, and we have to be concerned about those as well. So I'll go to the next slide. So in terms of what types of policies and regulations we have out there, there are many, but I will only discuss a few. The major ones are from the tri-agencies and are important for institutions that do receive federal grant money for research. There's also privacy legislation, and I'm going to provide two of the regulations that are in Ontario. And finally, there are institutional policies. So I'll be discussing a couple that they have at the University of Toronto, and other institutions probably have similar types. So the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, was first brought forward in 1998. There's been one significant revision and then a few minor ones. So this is why it's called TCPS 2. I expect that in the next couple of years, there will be further another major revision. I know that right now they're reviewing the document in terms of EDI and gender, which comes into play when I discuss quorum. And so this document is a requirement for all institutions that have tri-agency funding. And it's important for the institution, the Research Ethics Board, and for researchers to follow what they say. So there's three fundamental principles that are under the Tri-Council Policy Statement. The first one is respect for persons, and that looks at autonomy of individuals and the free and informed consent of them to participate in research. Welfare looks at risks versus benefits, making sure that the risks do not outweigh benefits to individual participants, and whenever possible, researchers should minimize the risks and maximize benefits for participants. And finally, justice. And this is very important in terms of equity in access to research participation, as well as to the benefits and outputs of research. And the newest one that we think about is the need for research data to be a shared output so that other researchers can use the same data so that you're not constantly going back to participants and putting them at additional risks. The Research Ethics Board is the body that reviews all human research conducted at or under the auspices of the institution. Quorum is 5 to 6 men and women. 2 are members knowledgeable in the fields and methods. 1 member knowledgeable in law. 1 member knowledgeable in ethics, and 1 member who is not affiliated with the institution and usually should represent the community or communities of the research type. So if the research that is usually sent to the REB is for, say, children, you'd like to have a community representative who is an advocate for children or what have you. At U of T, 5 to 6 is not enough. We have about 50 to 75 members in the REB system. This includes faculty and some community members and a few lawyers and bioethicists. And the reason why we have such a large contingency of REB members is that we have a lot of research. We see 1,600 new protocols a year, and we have about 5,000 active files. So there's always a lot of work to go around. We have 2 panels on the health sciences REB, and they review research from faculties of dentistry, engineering, medicine, nursing, public health, pharmacy, and social work. And then we have a social sciences, humanities, and education REB, which is split up into 3 panels. That is all of the Faculty of Arts and Science, information, music, our Faculty of Education, so OISE, and then our 2 other campuses, University of Toronto, Mississauga, and University of Toronto, Scarborough. So I'll go on to discuss how TCPS2 applies in terms of research data. So there is a chapter, it's chapter 2, that looks at confidentiality and privacy of data. And they begin by identifying the terms, which I don't know if these are the same in terms of what you're used to, and you can let me know. But we talk about privacy, the right to control information about oneself, and this is expressed through free and informed consent. Confidentiality, which is the obligation of researchers to safeguard entrusted information. Security, which involves physical, administrative, and technical safeguards for information. And then we talk about the identifiability of information in terms of 5 categories. And this is not necessarily how other policies represent these. So there's a lot of discussion about this. And I think also that a lot of researchers have a different understanding of what the terms anonymous and anonymized actually mean. So we talk about data being either directly identifiable, so you know exactly who it is by looking at the data. Indirectly identifiable, meaning that if you were to take some other publicly available data point, you could probably figure out who that individual is. Coded information, where direct identifiers are removed and replaced by a code, and there's a master code somewhere else. And you'd be surprised to see that how many researchers do not separate their master list from the coded data. So that's something that we always try to remind people, that even if it's, most data are held electronically, that the master code should not be in the same folder as the data. Anonymized data, which is irrevocably stripped of identifiers and the code discarded, and anonymous, where the data never had identifiers. And REBs need to determine that researchers have appropriately planned for and will maintain compliance with the privacy, confidentiality, and data security requirements, and that what they put into their protocols is in fact what is done. And I'll discuss a little bit later, there is a gap in what they see at the beginning of the protocol and then what happens later on. So in terms of privacy regulations, there are 2 in Ontario. The first is the Personal Health Information and Protection Act, or PHIPA. And we look at PHIPA for personal health information, and the point of PHIPA is to ensure that PHI, when it's used for research purposes, it's done so with consent or with a waiver from the REB. And the REB can only provide that waiver under very specific conditions and with an approvable research plan. So they have to know exactly what the researcher is going to do with the PHI, how the data will be kept securely, and who has access to the data within the research team and why, and what they will be doing. The second privacy regulation is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPA. FIPA has a component regarding access to information for administrative records, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is the protection of privacy piece. And that is whereby researchers who want to use administrative records, so student records, grades, HR records, for research purposes, get permission through consent or with a waiver, and there's an REB approved research plan. Personally identifiable information is protected and used only for approved purposes and not disclosed or accessed by unauthorized individuals. So another policy that I will share with you is brand new. It's only about 2 months old, and this is around the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy. And what it says is that institutions have to recognize that they need a research data management strategy. They have to recognize that data is an important input, and they have to provide guidance to develop research data management practices that are consistent with policies such as TCPS2 and privacy legislation, but also allows for the output of research to be available to other researchers. They also need to recognize the data that's created through research with Indigenous communities has to be managed according to principles and plans that's designed by these communities. So we have to work with Indigenous communities, and they have to be, at the forefront of creating the research data management policies that they think are necessary. A data management plan is required for all researchers to create at the planning stages of the research, and they must ensure to use it during and at the end of research. Okay, I'm seeing here, go slower. Okay, I'll try to go slower. Data deposit. So the idea is that all data from the tri-agency funded research will need to be deposited unless there are other requirements that have to be followed. So if the data are highly sensitive and cannot be reused, then we have to make sure that those types of research are not deposited. And the goal is to start phasing in this policy in 2022 and 2023. Do I have any questions at this point?
We have one question, Rachel. Actually, not two questions.
Okay.
So the first one is there a way to enforce what was put in the protocol? And it was one of the first slides.
Okay, so the answer is yes. We have something called post-approval review, where we have a member of our staff looking at primarily the higher risk protocols, and I will get into how they evaluate risk later on and what the levels are, where they actually go in and, well, it used to be a face-to-face type of thing, now it's virtual, to go over what they collect and to ensure that what was in the protocol is in fact what they're doing. And we also have a framework for research misconduct. So if a researcher were to conduct research that is not in the protocol, then they would be subject to an allegation of misconduct. And then I see the next question, where would the data need to be deposited? And that's an excellent question. And that's something that we're currently working on. So I know that the U of T data librarians are working on a variety of repositories. I know some currently exist, Dataverse being one of them, but there's ongoing discussion about whether there should be institutional only or whether there should be national repositories. What happens when there is a breach, a data breach? So when there is a data breach, it's all hands on deck. The first point of contact is usually the Research Ethics Board. There is the need for an investigation of how this happened. There is the need to report it to our privacy office or whoever the institution's privacy officers are. And then there may be the need to report it to the privacy commissioner. If it's on purpose, obviously there will be repercussions for that. Human error, sometimes there's repercussions for that as well. Then there's a question, how long should research data be kept? So this has changed. So it used to be we would tell researchers that they should be destroying their data after 7 years. And now with policies such as what I said before, the need for data management, whereby recognizing that research data are a valuable output that should be shared, we've no longer gone to destruction of data. We're now looking for, say, interim storage with the researcher until, usually now it's at the point of publication. The guidance is to put it out there as soon as possible, and then the long-term type of a repository. And actually that segues very nicely into the slide I have right now that I haven't discussed yet. So this is the Tri-Agency Statement of Principles on Digital Data Management. This, I think, came out in 2016 or 2017. It was updated this year, and the statement was made to declare that the tri-agencies, along with Canada, are joining the global community's push to open science and the sharing of digital data for other researchers. This policy discusses the requirements for the outputs of tri-agency funded research to be made available in a format and a repository that are easily discoverable, interpretable, and available. It also makes clear that we need to give credit to the original research team and make sure that any of the promises that they made with respect to how data would be used to participants are honored in all future data. So, this is a lovely statement. It's a little bit more difficult in how it's used, particularly with respect to the gap between what is promised to research participants versus what happens later on when data are deposited. And we can discuss that towards the end of this presentation. So I will go on to the next slide. So finally, there are some policies and guidelines that institutions implement. And I just have two here that I'm going to discuss. So one of them is access to administrative data of faculty, staff, or students. So we get, and I'm sure a lot of institutions have this, our institution gets a lot of requests from researchers, whether internal or external to the university, to look at administrative data. And this may be HR records, it could be records of students in terms of demographics or in terms of grades or a combination. And it's important that the university, provide that approval for access. And so there's a process, it actually just started a little while ago, a formalized process to request access to administrative data. The second one is with respect to surveying U of T members. And, similarly, there are a lot of requests for staff, students, faculty from internal and external researchers to want to, provide surveys to collect data. And, it's a very large pool. If you're conducting a survey, it may be a survey across Canada or maybe specific universities, but we have a very, rich population pool. And so there is a process by which it's the vice provost or the vice president of HR and equity, if it's for staff, to ensure that whichever population is being requested to participate in a survey has not been overburdened by other surveys. So that's why those two are there. I know that in some institutions, they rely on the Research Ethics Board to make those determinations, but at the University of Toronto, the primary gateway is within senior administration. So I now want to talk a little bit about how the REB looks at research in terms of sensitive data that will be collected. The risk levels of some topics are dependent on the location. So it's not just the method or the sensitivity of the topic. It's a really nuanced kind of conversation. It could be because of a geopolitical context. So some research that would be absolutely acceptable to be looking at in Canada, in other countries would be considered to be illegal. So that's something that the REB needs to be concerned about. The vulnerability of the participant group. And the way that is described in the Tri-Council policy statement, and it has evolved over time, we look at vulnerability as not always being present. It's not that one population is vulnerable, full stop. It's in the context of research or in the context of other kinds of circumstances. So for example, pandemic circumstances, are certain groups or communities more at risk or have a greater vulnerability. So an example would be, during current times, frontline workers may be a vulnerable group, depending on the type of research. We also look at identifiability of the data to be collected and whether that would be problematic for individuals or communities. And then we look at the regulations and policies, not just in Canada, but in the host country, in terms of figuring out what that risk level is. So this is how the REB determines risk. So they look at that vulnerability in the context of research. It's low, medium, or high. We then look at the research risk. So that may be the physical intervention, that may be the psychological or emotional aspects of the survey. So if you're asking questions like, please describe your most horrible moment in your life, that could potentially be emotionally or psychologically risky. And then we look at things like the social risk of the research to that individual. Is there stigma attached to that type of research? And then we look at any kinds of legal risks or financial risks to the individuals or to the communities that would be attached to the research. If the risk level is 1, and this means it's minimal risk, typically if it's straightforward survey research with non-sensitive questions, it's reviewed by a delegated process, which means that 1 to 2 members of the REB will look at it. If the risk level is higher, so a 2 or a 3, and that's by taking whether it's low, medium, high in one axis, low, medium, high in the other axis, and finding what the corresponding number is. On our online system now, it's kind of like an automatic thing. You put in low or medium or whatever, and it generates a number. So we don't quite see this matrix anymore. If it's risk level 2s or 3s, the study will be reviewed at the full board with all members present or at least quorum. And those would be the ones, as I was asked before, subject to post-approval review visits. So we make sure that we try to get all of those. The majority of the research that we see really fall into the low or the risk level 1, but we do have a significant minority of protocols that would fit into levels 2 and 3 that require that post-approval review visit. So I'll go on from there. Okay, I don't see anything else in the chat, so I will continue. So here are some of the REB recommended data security strategies that we have now. And what I have is, what the REBs look at, and then some of the issues that arise from these recommendations or gaps in recommendations. So the first one that we have is to limit the sensitive data collection. We ask that researchers only collect as much or what is needed for the research, that whenever possible, they use methods that allow for anonymous data collection. We ask that for higher risk research, use pseudonyms when possible. And sometimes we ask if it's a really sensitive or vulnerable population that the researcher consider using a proxy that's of less vulnerability. So for example, instead of going to children who are say living with cancer, you may want to speak to healthcare workers who work with that population, for example. So the problems with those recommendations is that sometimes you're limiting the ability to analyze the data you need and further usefulness of the data set. In terms of anonymity, you can't follow up. And if you're looking at, for example, we look at research involving suicidality, anonymity would not work. We need to be able to have contact information in case something looks like it's a problem. We need to go back to the participant. Sometimes you do need that specific participant group, otherwise you're compromising the research or the science. Sometimes anonymity can lead to poor quality responses. So an example of this is survey research that has a gift card for participation. A lot of the MTurk research, for example, participants may skip all the questions or answer them very cursively to get to that gift card. Pseudonyms may be identifiable if used, for many purposes. So there are people who like to use the same, usernames in a whole variety of, say, online forums, and so they're somewhat identifiable. And finally, that we ask researchers that they need to consider whether they need to collect IP address or other potential identifiers, because those, in fact, render, for example, a survey not anonymous. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat, so I will continue. The second type of security that we look at is physical security, and standard to our privacy laws. Data need to be in a locked cabinet in a locked office if they're hard copy records. We ask for a clean desk policy so that, if students are using a desk in a common area, say an office that other grad students are in, they make sure to take all of their papers or whatever, put them away and lock them up. We also ask that researchers do not carry data on their person or in their car. And when I put this in, and this is from a few years ago, this is the kids, a doctor losing 3,300 records on patients, and these were children with HIV. In fact, I've heard that there's another situation that has just happened very similar to this. So this was a situation where a researcher at Sick Kids Hospital took a laptop from the hospital with the intention of analyzing research data stored on it at home. However, they decided they were hungry, went down to a restaurant, leaving the vehicle in a Toronto parking lot. Laptop was inside, the vehicle was broken into, and the laptop was stolen. The personal health information stored on the laptop include the name and hospital number of each patient, clinical information relating to medical conditions, including testing dates, diagnoses, and answers to interviews, drug therapy, and HIV status. And the only security measure on the laptop was a login password. And this was really a watershed moment for the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, making sure that all devices at Sick Kids and all the other hospitals in Ontario need to be encrypted. So the devices need to be encrypted. If there are uses of USB keys or what have you, they all have to be encrypted. The requirements from the IPC have changed over time, so they're more stringent now that we have better technology. But this was really the first big data loss. And in terms of, I was asked a question about what kind of penalties for things like this. Well, there's reputational damage for sure, but there's also fines that are enacted on sometimes the individual and on the institution as well. So I think the fines can go up to $150,000, something like that. I don't know what Sick Kids was fined or what the researcher was fined, but this has lived in notoriety for that researcher. And the final point, which is another story I'm going to tell right now, is about the need to fight to keep data private and, when necessary, bury them. So this is a picture of Russell Ogden. He was a master's student in criminology at Simon Fraser University in 1994. Conducting research on assisted suicide at a time, I don't know if people remember the Sue Rodriguez saga about the right to die, medical assisted suicide, which now has become standard in several provinces. It was highly controversial and illegal in Vancouver and in BC. So his research relied upon interviews with people who were actively participating in the process, and he witnessed 11 assisted suicides. Shortly following his successful defense of his master's degree, he was subpoenaed to appear before a coroner's inquest, recognizing that the police may try to go into his home, he took the data. And I remember seeing him present on this at one of our ethics conferences in probably 2002, which is when I started in this field. He buried them in a field so that if any cop were to enter his property, they would not be able to find these. So so he was subpoenaed to appear before the coroner's inquest. He was asked to reveal his sources and he refused. And what he used was something called the Wigmore test. So basically there's 4 points to this Wigmore test. And I believe it's also used for psychiatrists and other kinds of doctor-patient privilege relationships. And the Wigmore test, there's 4 points. The first one is that the communication or the relationship between, in this case, the researcher and the participant, originated in a confidence that cannot be disclosed. So he had promised absolute confidentiality to all of his participants. The second is that this element of confidentiality must be essential to the maintenance of the relationship between the parties. And so he described that this was essential in order for him to conduct the research. The third is that the relationship must be one in which the community ought to foster. And it's recognized that research is an essential element of society, and that we need to respect confidentiality of political scientists or in this case criminologists in conducting their research, or any research really. You need to have this confidentiality. And then the fourth point, that injury to the community, injury to the people for whom the confidentiality was promised would be greater than the benefit that the community or society would be gained for opening up the data and having them viewed. And in this case, he won. And sorry, I think I'm moving this too fast. And this really was the first time that this Wigmore criteria was used in the context of research. So the second one that I'm going to talk about, and this one probably has a little bit more ethically challenging dynamics to it. And you may want to consider whether this was in fact the right call or not. This was around the Luca Magnata. This was around the Luca Magnata case. So I don't know if people remember Luca Magnata. He is a convicted killer of a student in Montreal. And he also had mailed body parts to politicians. This was several years ago. So these two researchers are Christine Ruckert and Colette Perrant. They're at the U of Ottawa. So he allegedly was a participant in a research study that their research assistant had conducted back in somewhere between 2004 and 2008. He was believed to be known as Jimmy in a video recording, and it was for a study entitled Sex Work and Intimacy, Escorts and Their Clients. So these two researchers had to go to court to challenge the seizure. So police had actually gone into the University of Ottawa, and I have a colleague there in the ethics office there who saw this. They physically went into the U of O and seized the videotape. And these two researchers had to go in front of the courts to fight to have the video recording taken back so that it wouldn't be seen by the court. And what was important about this, a couple of things, and this is good to the question of who gets to decide when the injury is greater than the benefit. This really is a case-by-case kind of thing, and it's the judge who makes this decision. So the president of the U of O did not feel that this was an important case for the university to assist with in terms of legal funds. I believe the president at the time was Paul Martin, who, obviously he, being part of the government previously, he had a different lens on this. And so there was a lot of pushback in terms of having legal support for these researchers. CAUT, which is the Faculty Association for all teachers, university teachers in Canada, I believe they first got involved to support these researchers legally, and then later on U of O did eventually pay for it. So the Wigmore criteria was used in this case, and the Quebec Superior Court Justice, she did rule that the importance of preserving the relationship between the researcher and the subject outweighed the video's usefulness to police. So she made that decision that the injury of social science by allowing a confidential video to be exposed was that would be greater than protecting it. And obviously he was convicted, so it didn't really make a difference. It's important to also note that video recordings usually are supposed to be destroyed when it's very sensitive data, should be destroyed soon after they're transcribed. So I believe in this case, the REB had given 7 years. So they were close to that 7-year mark where the video would have been destroyed. And then there's a question of how did the police know about this video? And I think that there was another person who had been a student at the time who remembered this individual, and they were the ones who told the police. So that was an interesting little tidbit as well. So are there any more questions? I don't see anything else in the chat, so I will continue. So in terms of electronic safeguards, the REB recommends that all devices are encrypted, that when researchers are not on a secure server, so for example, when they're traveling internationally, that they use VPNs. For research at the University of Toronto, they're told to save data on OneDrive or ShareBox that only allows for secure access by team members. We get a lot of questions around Dropbox when it's more than one institution involved in the research. And what the REB usually says is that as long as the data are encrypted, that they can use Dropbox. I don't know if other people here have different perspectives on that, whether Dropbox is in fact secure. I would love to hear that. We have acceptable platforms for online research. So there's RedCap, where we have institutional servers, Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey if they're using a Canadian account so that the data are housed in Canada. There was a real concern. There used to be a company called Fluid Surveys that had been subsumed by SurveyMonkey, and after a certain period of time, we were told that all of the data were being housed elsewhere. And I think at one point we were told the US and then Portugal. The REB does not want the data to be in other jurisdictions when possible, particularly the US, because of the Patriot Act, where the US government has, or at least had, authority to go through to demand that that data be turned over for government purposes. I think the Patriot Act is still in effect. There are some regions, for example, maritime provinces, that will not allow research to be sent to individuals in their jurisdiction if the online platform saves the data to a different jurisdiction. So I'm seeing here. Let's see. Paper code. What about? You're using words that I don't know. So let's go back. We'll go back to GIT code. I'll have to ask at the end what that means. Sorry. Okay. So, difficulties that we have with these kinds of recommendations. Data may not be encrypted when in use, so they're vulnerable to unauthorized access during those times when they're in use. It is illegal, as far as I'm aware, to bring encrypted devices to some countries, so Iran and China, so that negates the whole point of being able to have encrypted devices in countries, in countries where we're concerned about collection of sensitive data. The internet or VPNs may be unavailable or unreliable, and this would be in rural areas as well as countries with authoritarian regimes, where often that is the focus of the research. And researchers may be forced to show data at border crossings, which is a very big concern. So regardless of a researcher encrypting their laptop, if they're at threat of physical or legal issue, they probably will show their data. And to highlight this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about Alexander Sadov. So this Sadov was a student, a PhD student at U of T in political science. He was born in northern Tajikistan, and he returned there in 2014 to work on a research project. He was a U of T student, but the project was actually a summer project for the University of Exeter's UK Economic and Social Research Council. It was a contract position. And the project was investigating the failure of Western approaches to conflict management in former Soviet republics. On June 15th, he traveled to Koroj, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name, in eastern Tajikistan to interview a number of civil society representatives. The next day, he was apprehended by security officials during an interview with the head of an opposition Democratic Party. He was then transported to the State Committee for National Security office for collecting information that, quote, undermined national security, unquote. Once he was detained, the University of Exeter, the University of Toronto, and the UK Economic and Social Research Council, they made statements that he was a scholar, that he was not a spy, and that the purpose had been purely academic for why he was there. And despite this, he was formally charged under Article 305 of the Criminal Code, high treason, which carried a prison sentence of 12 to 20 years. He was put into a pre-trial detention center, and his case was classified as top secret. After a much publicized campaign that his supervisor at the University of Toronto launched, the charges were dropped and he was returned to Canada in September of that year. So these are real life concerns that the REB works with. They're not just theoretical. Sometimes they really do come into fruition. So the REB needs to be very, very concerned and need to ask the right questions of researchers and to think of all of the nuanced dimensions. So I'm going to talk about a couple of extra little pieces. The first being, the REB is now having to consider the requirements or the concerns regarding virtual research. We all pivoted from face-to-face research on interviews and focus groups to online. Often Zoom is used for those purposes as well as for discussions between research teams or research team members where potentially confidential or sensitive data may be discussed. So initially, when researchers started to use Zoom and the REBs were aware, this was back in March 2020, they were concerned about the use of the technology itself. There were a couple of reports from the Citizen Lab showing that the encryption was not complete and that there was ways to lift the recordings and to see people and to collect data. There were also the Zoom bombing incidents that had happened. The technology in terms of security has gotten better. We now have institutional licenses with password protection. The encryption that Zoom is using is much improved. We still have questions regarding PHI involved research, particularly some of our faculties, so social work and there's clinical psychology in the Faculty of Education. They may be conducting therapy types of research projects, and we're still not quite sure whether those are, whether the Zoom, the PHI version of Zoom is appropriate and secure enough. So that's where we still need further information. The other piece is now we have to worry about not necessarily the technology for the interviews or focus groups, but the settings where the participant is. So a lot of the research that we see that involve one-to-one types of interviews, the individual on the other side of the screen may not necessarily have total privacy. Some of the studies look at youth and the effects of pandemic on them. Parenting situations. We know that there are mental health issues and increases in domestic abuse. And it's very difficult for researchers to conduct interviews with participants in those kinds of situations, not knowing whether, the abusive spouse is at home with them, whether other people can hear the content of the conversations, etc. So there are, continuing issues around virtual research that REBs had not anticipated, at the beginning of this. Just briefly, I'm going to talk about the secondary use of PHI, or personally identifiable information. So these may involve, as I had said earlier, a database or data set that was created for research purposes, but sometimes they come from administrative or clinical data. So we often see data sets that are either under a prescribed entity under PHIPA, so they can be used for research purposes or for a government ministry. They will require REB approval of the research plan and a waiver of consent if the data are identifiable. And so I'm going to go back. I had said that there are requirements that the REB must consider in terms of whether a waiver of consent is available. So the questions that need to be considered by the REB for those points: one, can the research be done without the waiver of consent? They have to be able to show that it is impracticable, which means not just, they don't want to do it, but that they would not be able to obtain consent from these individuals because people have moved away, people have died, those kinds of things, that there's a higher standard which they have to prove that it's just not possible to get consent from everyone. They also have to demonstrate that the research itself has potential benefits to society. They have to be able to demonstrate that those potential benefits far outweigh any foreseeable harms to data subjects, and those harms are minor. They need to explain who on the research team has authorized access and why, and individuals who do gain access must sign contracts to maintain confidentiality. There have to be data security measures while the researchers have the data, and then there needs to be a set time frame for the return or the destruction of the data, and they have to explain when that is going to be and how. So there are also concerns that extend beyond the Research Ethics Board, and it's important to figure out who these should then apply to. So who has access to sensitive data? So this would be within the research team or the PI. There may be access due to department or team mishandling. So I've become aware of situations where several labs have access to one license. Usually it's for things like Qualtrics or another kind of online survey platform. And so technically everybody has equal access to each other's survey results, and that's not appropriate. We need to find ways to not let that happen. So even if everyone says, "Oh, don't worry, I won't look at anyone's data but my own," that's not really secure enough. They have to be able to, shut off what everyone can see. Another one, and I have to say that this is very common, forgetting to remove access when a team member leaves. There's often, a rotating door, or sorry, a revolving door around access to the research team or membership on the research team, and so you have to be well aware of people coming and going, putting people on, and remembering to take people off. Unauthorized access through phishing emails to obtain passwords. I'm sure everyone is well aware of all those. The latest ones is it looks like it's your colleague who's trying to reach you and asking for a password. Research team members may have conflicts of interest, and I'll discuss that in a minute. and inadvertent access by friends, partners, family members who access shared devices. And that is very common, especially with everyone having their kids at home during virtual school and having, having other family members at home. There may be a common computer that they use, and logging in and out may feel like it's, it's extra work to do that, but it is important if it is a common device in the household. So just a brief comment here. So we were visited by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. They came to U of T and to other research institutions to warn us about foreign threats to our data. There's 2 points of concern. One is where there's unauthorized access to data through phishing or hacking, which we're aware of. The second, on the right, is that we need to be vigilant and cautious about researchers, particularly students who come in from other countries who may be conducting research here in order to access data to bring back to their native countries. So that's something that everyone should be aware of because it is a concern. So a moment on data deposit and future use. These are the focuses of the tri-agency policies that I discussed at the beginning of the presentation. It's important to note that REBs don't review data deposit and future uses beyond what's in, say, the consent information. And this appears to be a gap where the researcher completes the research, they're about to publish. There's some journals require that they deposit their data into whatever repository within a certain period of time of publication. And we don't know if the researchers are following a data management plan that they've created that specify which data should go in and in what form or not, as well as we don't check to make sure that participants who said they don't want their data to be deposited have those data removed. And it becomes extremely difficult to ascertain once there is, de-identification and the consent forms are, stored somewhere else, which data should be in and which ones should be out. And that should be part of the consent process. What we also know that data custodians don't necessarily make sure that the other researchers who come in have REB approved plans for use of those data. There is a requirement right now under TCPS that any projects involving anonymized data, so that's where once there were identifiers and the identifiers have been stripped, to be submitted for review. So we don't have someone who's checking to make sure those REB approvals are there before giving access to data. We're hoping that there will be a solution, and that might be part of either the tri-agency policy on research data management that I discussed before, or maybe in that third major revision of Tri-Council policy statement. But it's really important that there is communication between the data security professionals, the data custodians, the researchers, and the REB. So as I said here, data security is a joint responsibility between participants, custodians, researchers, REBs, and data security experts. So in summary, U of T researchers conduct a significant breadth and depth of human research that involves collection, analysis, and storage of sensitive data. REBs use regulations, policies, and understanding of risk to assess the sensitivity of data and provide appropriate recommendations. These may consider what data will be collected and from whom, physical and electronic security measures. The recommendations may not always be sufficient, and researchers need to be cognizant of potential risks to data security and to the risks to themselves. Data deposit and long-term storage are beyond the scope of the REB, and other roles need to take ownership of data security issues. And finally, security of sensitive human research data is a joint responsibility between REBs, researchers, data custodians, and data security experts. So I will open it up to questions. Let me see. I will stop sharing for now.
So I have a question, Rachel.
Yes.
What happens when people get permission to do research on sensitive data? Where do they put their data? I mean, to do it in your lab with your little laptop or workstation, that's not secure. Where is it that people actually do this?
So I would say for the highest sensitivity data, so if you're looking at the ICES data or other prescribed entities, sometimes they have the requirement that you have to physically go into their secure site. And part of that is to make sure you don't take anything with you. But otherwise, it's all over. Like this is probably the biggest concern that we have, is that research happens everywhere. Most research happens outside of four walls. And so it really is a matter of looking at a continuum of security and finding solutions that, work best for that specific case.
Yeah, the main reason I ask is you may be aware that we are at SciNet are trying to work our way to becoming a sanctioned place for doing research on sensitive data. For lack of a better word. So
right.
We want to make sure that we comply with certain levels of security, certain policies. So as long as we're compliant, then that we should be able to become a location where people can store sensitive data and compute on it, because you need to compute on it, otherwise it's useless, right? So and yes, I think we've seen cases where people have this data lying around on little keys or on their computers, and there's no real oversight on security, right? So it's a big concern, and it's not easy to be compliant.
Exactly, and I think that's where people in my office and REBs and people in your office need to communicate, because there isn't going to be we need communication in order to have the ideal solution, and it won't be for all types of research. It really has to be case by case. But if you're looking at data analysis of specific research and the highest sensitivity, if we can have a common understanding of what the requirements are, then we can hopefully at least solve that piece.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
And by the way, I wanted to thank you, because this has been very useful. I certainly for us, but I believe for a lot of people. And since we have recorded this, I'm hoping that many more people will watch your presentation, because it's really important.
Thank you. And usually we don't get to talk very much about sort of where the research come from, and then the importance of the security. So thank you I really appreciate that Rafael invited me to this.
Okay, so thanks very much, Rachel. It was
very
useful.
I have some case studies. Yeah, I don't know if people. Okay. I have a couple of case studies, but I think we're running out of time. Is that correct?
You have 10 minutes.
I have 10 minutes.
Rachel, so you can. Yeah, you still have some time.
Okay, so let me try to go back in. No, that's not going to do it. Did that work? Everyone can see the question page? Case studies. Okay, so I'm going to just do the first one, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, so the first case study. A graduate student wants to examine how the loss of sports programs during the pandemic has affected youth in low socioeconomic status neighborhoods. Her protocol seeks to conduct Zoom interviews with youth 14 to 17, as well as have them complete online surveys using Qualtrics that include measures of anxiety and depression. What risks might the researcher and REB identify with the use of Zoom for the interviews, including privacy and data security? What should the researchers consider with using Qualtrics as an online platform for the survey, as well as data security off the platform? And what considerations need to be made for a data management plan for long-term security and potential access by the researchers? I'm going to see if I can get this here. Okay. Yep, so Qualtrics may not store data in Canada. That's important to find out. And I'll say that this case study is reflective of what we see, especially with everyone being at home and seeing the mental health effects. This is quite common that the REB has to worry about risk to participants if they are overheard during the interviews. Yep, absolutely. Okay, we'll see if there's any other comments. I would say that, in terms of data management plans, because these are youth, it may not be appropriate for them to, have their data for further analysis. On one hand, this is a time where, this pandemic time is a unique, microcosm of extreme stress. And, that may be a worthwhile, subject matter in the future. But then again, these are youth, and they may have different ideas about their data being used, once they reach adulthood. So that's a concern. If she records the interview, it gets saved to Zoom servers, which may also be outside of Canada. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and depending on who else is in the household, so they may hear, as was said, but also the camera could catch other conversations, which could be problematic as well. So that's something to be concerned about. Consent of minors, yep, absolutely. Especially, if it is looking at mental health issues, and there could be issues around capacity and duty to report and those kinds of issues. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think what I will do, because we are running out of time, I believe the slides have been put into the portal, so the other two case studies are there. So if people want to look, so I will go to, yeah, thank you, Raphael. They are available, so you can look at the other two case studies. And I will just go to, well, one is, if anyone wants to contact me for further questions or discussion, there's my email address, as well as for my department, if you have more general questions you'd like to follow up on. And this is an optional assignment. So this is the tutorial for researchers and REB members for the Tri-Council policy statement. So this is optional. It will give you further information on how ethical research should be done in Canada, and focuses on, I believe, the first 8 chapters or so. So please take a look at this, and if you want to discuss it further with me, let me know.
This was amazing. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we have just 4 minutes left, so almost the end. Thank you everyone for attending. Those three days, you'll receive a survey. Marcello, I don't know if you're still there. So the goal of the survey is to know, from you how you, how you like the session, those 3 days, if there are any improvements you'd like to see, any topics that you'd like to see in the future. Those 3 days were really made for you, so we want to get your opinion on this. And Marcello is just reminding us attendance code for today's number 2.
And I would like to ask everybody who attended to please propagate this to your colleagues, your friends, anybody who you know, so that we can get more people aware of cybersecurity in general, research ethics, all the good stuff that is necessary for the research we all do.
Yes, thanks, Danny. So we are really here to support research. So that's the goal, is to improve our content over time. So again, if you have ideas, please let us know. Any feedback is welcome. And Rachel, thanks again for participating today. It was very, very helpful and appreciated.
You're very welcome.